Meantime, House abruptly going out of session as lawmakers try to keep the Department of Homeland Security up and running. Deadline tonight. Last-minute twists and turns coming just hours ahead of that deadline. Well, that's when the agency faces this partial shutdown unless some sort of compromise is reached. For her part, Nancy Pelosi is having none of it. The House Minority Leader says a stopgap funding measure is basically a gimmick by the Republicans to service Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit next week.
I have heard some other things that some of their colleagues have said, that the Republicans in the House are acting like crazy people. That, I thought, was something I could identify with. They could have Benjamin Netanyahu speak to Congress when government is open instead of closed. I think they'd look bad doing that, don't you? And I think that's one reason they're kicking the can down the road.
Joining me now, Democratic Congressman Brad Sherman from California, who's also refusing to take a paycheck if Homeland Security is shut down. First, Congressman, I'd like to get your thoughts on Nancy Pelosi and saying that this is all a GOP stunt to kick the can down the road because they want the government open so Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu can speak before an open government. Do you agree with her?
Well, I think it's important to keep the Department of Homeland Security open and open for more than 3 weeks. And it makes us look bad not only to Netanyahu, but everywhere around the world. We're trying to put together alliances, join the American team. And if you're funding Department of Homeland Security 2 weeks at a time, 3 weeks at a time, then the planning isn't going on. The morale is terrible. People are focused not on how to connect the dots, but how to get a payday loan. That's an insane way to run a critical part of government.
Well, since we're talking about Netanyahu, and some Democrats have said that they're not going to show up to hear him, are you?
I will certainly be there to hear what the Prime Minister of Israel has to say, even though I think the way this speech was arranged and the timing of it is not conducive to achieving Netanyahu's objectives.
Okay.
He is trying to get members of Congress to vote to override a possible presidential veto of additional sanctions and to personalize this, to make it partisan, to do it without telling the administration, makes it much more difficult for Democrats to vote that way.
I don't know if you happen to hear the dialogue that I had going on with Brett Baer before you joined us, but there's critical information coming out about the relationship between al-Qaeda and Iran right now. And that's all coming at the same time.
I've been talking about that for a long, long time.
Well, but nobody's really seen these documents until now. So maybe Benjamin Netanyahu will have a thing or two to say that the American people and the world, quite frankly, might want to listen to next week.
Well, I think the connections between al-Qaeda and Iran have been there. Keep in mind, the Iran-led Shiite extremist alliance, Maliki and many of those in Iraq, and Maliki, of course, was installed by the United States, but he's part of that Iranian alliance, as is Assad and Hezbollah.
Okay, so
that alliance is much more dangerous than ISIS, has killed far more Americans than ISIS.
So you are in favor of not having as many sanctions against Iran, and you are still in favor of this administration trying to strike a nuclear deal with that country in light of these documents coming out?
These documents don't tell us anything that I didn't know a long time ago. You negotiate with your enemies. Roosevelt sat down with Stalin. Nixon negotiated with North Vietnam while they were killing Americans on the ground. You have to negotiate with your enemies, but that doesn't mean you have to agree to a bad deal. And if it's a bad deal, the Congress should respond by passing massive additional sanctions, the kinds of sanctions I was proposing back when President Bush prevented them from being adopted.
Well, we'll see if you're going to get your paycheck or not, and whether or not the DHS stays open for the deadline tonight. Congressman Brad Sherman, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So here's a question for you. How well do you know your neighbors? Well, the former neighbors of Jihadi John shocked that the ISIS executioner was living right next door.
I never thought that